Hello, Netrunner fans, and welcome to my review of Intervention. This is the fourth data pack in the Flashpoint cycle. In part 1 of this video, we're going to be looking at the runner cards. Part 2, we'll look at all the corp cards. The first card we're looking at is a new event for Anarch. This is En Passant. It is 0 to play. It is 2 influence. It's in a sabotage subtype. Play only if you've made a successful run this turn. Trash an unres piece of ice you passed during the last run you made this turn. This is a pretty powerful card. I think if only for its interaction with two really common Anarch cards, which are DDoS and Blackmail out of Valencia. Both of these cards have the same basic idea where you can make runs where the corp isn't able to res ice. And so that's going to give you a really easy option to play En Passant because you'll be able to just destroy the ice after you use that other card effect. Now, ice destruction is already something we can do pretty well in Anarch, but since Parasite and Clone Chip have been nerfed on the most wanted list, I think we've been seeing less and less of that, more just using like the strong Anarch Breaker suite, especially powered by Faust and David, to just overcome and break ice. The DDoS decks, and they generally tend to be pretty siphon-oriented, these decks are a little bit different in that they tend to try to keep the corp out of a position where they can get their board really off the ground. And this card, I think, has a lot of potential in a deck like that. I could definitely see it in Val, because having access to Blackmail as well really gives you a powerful option that you wouldn't have out of another Anarch. So I think this is probably going to be Val. I could maybe see it in some other aggressive DDoS, like siphon spam oriented Anarch. And I think just generally this is going to see a little bit of play, if only in those strategies. The next card is also for Anarch. This is Frantic Coding. It's 3 to play, it's 3 influence. It's an event. Look at the top 10 cards of your stack. If any of those cards are programs, you may install one of them, lowering the install cost by 5, trash the rest of those cards. There are definitely some tempting ways to use this card, but I think that the particular implementation here is probably going to keep it in your box. Now the big thing here is we have Paperclip and Black Orchestra, stuff like that. If you trash those, you'll later be able to reinstall them. And the same might be true with something like Retrieval Run. But I think we can already do that sort of stuff better with Max and or with the card Inject, which I think is vastly superior to this card in a lot of ways. In order for this card to really be worth it, you need to have one of these big programs that you're going to install that costs at least 5. So right there, that's a pretty serious requirement. And then you're also going to have a use in the way I just described of trashing all those cards. At 3 cost, I'm not really sure if I see a place for this, but if we saw in the future a big, really powerful program that was kind of the driver of an Anarch deck, I could see this card maybe seeing some play. For right now, I think both Max and Inject can do this sort of thing much better. The next card is a new criminal console. This is the Gauntlet. It's 5 to play, it's 1 influence. It's a hardware console. It gives you 2 MU. Whenever you access cards from HQ during a run, access 1 additional card for each piece of ice protecting HQ that you broke all subroutines on during this run. And it's limit 1 console per player, as they all are. I think this card is pretty obviously good. Pretty much whenever there's a reasonable to use accessing additional cards like multi-access effect, it's going to be playable. And this one is a 5 to play console that gives you 2 MU. That's going to be useful, I think, especially outside of Criminal. At that 1 influence, that's going to be really easy to do in Shaper especially. This is kind of like a HQ interface, except it's potentially even better if they're really piling on an HQ. And that 2 MU, I think, is really critical to a lot of Shaper decks if you want to really have a big rig. At 5 to play, I'm not sure I'm seeing a lot of use for this out of Criminal. I think we've already got better consoles that I'd be much more likely to play out of there, especially Desperado. but I think this could definitely see some play in Shaper because it's this 2MU and it's got a really nice multi-access effect. And just as a note, I really like the way they did this multi-access effect. Having multi-access tied to the icebreaker interaction is, I think, just a better way to do it than it just improving runs. It's going to be more interactive. It's going to involve using the fundamental point of interaction between the players, and I really like that. The next card is an icebreaker for criminals. This is Saker. It's 4 to install, it's 1MU, it's 2 influence, and it starts with 1 strength. It's an icebreaker fractor. It has credit, break barrier subroutine, 2 credits plus 2 strength, 2 credits, return Saker to your grip, de-res a barrier. Use this ability only after you use Saker to break all of the subroutines on that barrier during a single encounter. Like with the other birds, this is kind of a mediocre icebreaker that has this cool de-res piece of ice effect. And I feel the same way about this one as I did the other ones, except I think this one is going to see even less play. And the reason for that is, generally, Criminal has been willing to spend some influence on a decent icebreaker for barriers. And in the past, it's largely been Corroder, but now that Paperclip has been in the mix, I think that's been even better as an option. And really, while this is probably one of the best options we have in faction, other than maybe Breach, which you can't use on remotes, I think you're really going to need some reason to be using the de-res thing in order for this to be worth playing over an icebreaker that's going to cost you influence. I think Paperclip or Corroder is pretty good bang for your buck in terms of spending your influence within Criminal. And so I think really this is going to rely, like some of the others, on you having a good reason to use the de-res thing. And right now, I'm not convinced that the con strategy has enough stuff to really make these inefficient icebreakers work. But if we see some cards in the future that make it easier maybe to reinstall them or give you some reason why you'd want them to come in and out of play, I could see this seeing a little play because it is a fairly reasonable barrier breaker. Not as good as the out-of-faction ones, but it's fairly reasonable as an in-faction criminal breaker. Next up is a new resource for Criminal. This is Blockade Runner. It's 1 to install, it's 1 influence, it's a connection. It has double click. Draw 3 cards, shuffle 1 card from your grip into your stack. I think this card has a ton of potential, mostly in Criminal, but I could maybe see it also in like Anarch. The big thing about this is, first of all, this is much better, I would say, than Mr. Lee, which is a very similar effect in faction. The biggest thing about this is it only costs 1 to install. So early in the game, it's going to be much easier to drop this down and start using it to get set up. And I think that's really, really good in Criminals. I don't know about you guys, but the Criminal decks that I build tend to have a whole bunch of one-of awesome run event type effects. And there's a lot of times where the game context, you just have some card you don't need. Like an easy example is Inside Job. If your opponent isn't making some big server that you're trying to get into, you don't really need Inside Job. And this is going to be a perfect way to find the game context driven effects that you need at the right time and fix your hand, get you the stuff you need as quickly as possible. Another thing I point out is that you can tutor this up with Hostage, and I think it actually works reasonably well with Hostage because a lot of times Hostage decks play a bunch of one-of connections that are also very game context driven, stuff like Political Operative. So being able to find the right one of those at the right time is critical. I really like this card. I think this is something that Criminal really needs, which is a way to manipulate a draw effect kind of thing. And they have some draw effects that have been sort of meh, but this one I think really does have some teeth to it. I think this is definitely going to see some play. Next up is a new ID for Shaper. This is Ellie Smoke Skovac. She's the cynosure of the net. She's 0 link, she's 40-15. She's a Gmod and she's stealth. She has 1 recurring credit. Use this credit to pay for using icebreakers. This ID, I think, has been highly anticipated, and I definitely anticipate seeing play. This is awesome. Now, the biggest thing I see about this is the problem I've had with stealth decks in the past is that you usually have to play a bunch of cloaks, which requires a whole ton of MU, and that's a mess. Lately, we've seen Netrunner, which is probably the best stealth card to date. And now we have this ID that's just going to, from turn one, have a stealth credit. So if you have one of those stealth icebreakers or you have an SMC to go get it, you're going to be able to break stuff right off the bat. And that addresses one of the core problems that stealth has had since the beginning, which is that it takes forever to get set up and you just kind of have to let the corp do their thing. This is going to dramatically reduce setup time. And I also think that you can pretty much do all of the stealth credits you need just with this ID, Netrunner, and Ghost Runner. I don't even know if you really need Cloak, and if you do, you're probably only playing one. Generally, I think that's going to massively streamline the stealth breakers because you're not going to have these extra MU cards, and it's just generally going to reduce the amount of clutter in your deck. I think this ID has a lot of flexibility. I think there's a lot of different ways to build this. You could be really aggressive, or you could play maybe more of a big rig style. All around, I definitely think this is a good addition to the Shaper card pool and will absolutely see some play. Next up is a new piece of hardware for Shaper. This is Top Hat. It's 0 to play, it's 1 influence. Whenever you make a successful run on R&D, instead of accessing cards, you may choose one of the top 5 cards of R&D and access it. You cannot access any other cards in R&D during this run. The first thing I want to point out with this is something I've seen a few people get wrong, which is you don't get to look at the top 5 and then pick one. You just name whichever one you want and you get to access that one. So you basically say, oh, I want card 3, and you just access it. The other point I wanted to make is that I've seen several people mention that this could work with Eater, and I think it's pretty clearly not intended to work with Eater, so I'm assuming that doesn't work. This card is pretty antithetical to the way that we normally do multi-access with Shaper. Usually we're playing like R&D interfaces or Maker's Eye or something like that where we're just accessing a bunch of cards. This is going to give us a little more flexibility with which card we access, but it's not going to let us access more cards. And for that reason, I really don't think this is going to see a lot of play. Probably the best thing that I can come up with this is effects that let you look at the top of R&D. I think the best one of those we have in the game is Find the Truth from the previous data pack. That's an Adam card, and it's one of his directives, so we could start with it in play. This might be reasonable in that sort of thing because you'll be able to look at the top card. If it's an agenda, you can go get it. And if it's not, then you can use this top hat thing to access a different card. That's a pretty limited use, and I'm not even sure if it's really worth it. And for that, I think that this card's cool. I'm just not sure really how to use this in a very effective way. I think it's going to be better to just do multi-access in an overwhelming number of situations. Next up is a new icebreaker for Shaper. This is Blackstone. It's 4 to install, it's 1 MU, it's 2 influence, it's 3 strength. It's an icebreaker fractor. It has credit, break barrier subroutine. 3 credits, plus 4 strength for the remainder of this run. Use this ability only by spending at least 1 credit from a stealth card. Well, I can absolutely tell you which fractor I'm going to play in my stealth deck. This one. This is awesome. Like with the more modern stealth breakers, you can use this without stealth credits. So if you run into barriers that have 3 or less strength, you're just going to be able to break them and you don't require stealth credits. That's huge. There's a lot of good barriers that are 3 and below. And if you somehow have other ways to boost this strength, or you play like Data Sucker or something, you wouldn't even need stealth credits. Now on top of that, 7 strength, that's going to get you through virtually all barriers. There's a few that are maybe bigger than that, but they don't see a ton of play. And this is going to cut through most barriers. You're going to be able to break them cheaply. I think this is absolutely a staple for the new stealth decks, and I think that there's basically no reason to play like Black Cat or even just Corroder or Paperclip over this, because you're just going to be able to get a lot of value out of this. I think it's on par with a lot of other barrier breakers, and the fact that it can chew through the really high strength barriers could matter in some situations. With Netmercur, Smoke, and now this, I really do think that stealth is coming of its own and could be a really viable way to play Shaper. We'll have to see. Next up is a neutral current. This is Government Investigations. It's 0 to play, it's 0 influence. It's an event current, and that means this card is not trashed until another current is played or the corp scores an agenda. While secretly spending credits, players cannot spend 2 credits. Well, since Nisei Division is becoming so dominant, this card has to be printed to keep that in check. Just kidding. The main reaction I have to this card is I don't want to play in a metagame where this card is actually good enough. If we're playing so many side games that you have to play a current like this, that seems problematic to me. Now, I have in many of my recent reviews talked about how I think Nisei Division is on the uptick. We've seen a lot of cards that are much, much stronger for that type of deck. And generally, we've seen a lot more powerful side game related stuff. This is going to be a way to counteract that. I'm not sure there's really a big reason to do that, but it is maybe possible that there would be a metagame in the future where you would need to. And I don't know if I really like the idea of that metagame existing, because that many side games would be really fiddly to actually play out. But I do think this card has a logical role against this Nisei Division sort of strategy. I'd point out, I think this card would actually be more interesting if it said you couldn't spend 0. That would at least force the corp to pay the credits, which would counteract some of the Nisei Division advantage. But that's kind of a nitpick. I really don't think this card's going to see play. The final runner card in the pack is a new neutral resource. It's called Citadel Sanctuary. It's unique. It's 2 to play. It's 0 influence. It's a location. If you are tagged when your turn ends, force the corp to trace 1. If unsuccessful, the runner removes 1 tag. Then it has trash. Trash all cards in your grip. Prevent all meat damage. This is a really, really neat anti-flatline tool. First of all, this first part of it, the removing a tag thing, that's awesome. That's not only going to be really effective against things like hard-hitting news, but it's also good if you're playing card effects that tag you, right? Like Siphon or Vamp, stuff like that's going to tag you. This is going to be a clickless way to ditch tags, and that's awesome. Now, this prevent meat damage thing, that's a little clumsy. You got to trash all the cards in your grip. That's obviously bad, but it's pretty good against Boom. And that's definitely been a monstrous card. It's really strong at Worlds. We've been seeing a lot of Boom. And this is a pretty good way to deal with the Boom kill. They're going to have to double Boom you. This is going to save you from that first one. That's really strong. I really like this design. I think this is a much more interesting way to do a sort of Plascrete effect. I think the fact that this has utility with runner card effects because of the tag ditching thing is a huge, huge positive step in the design of this type of thing. I really, really strongly prefer these hoser cards to have some sort of use outside of just stopping some other card effect, and this is a really, really good way to do that. That's going to do it for part 1 of my intervention review. Be sure to tune into part 2 where we look at all of the corp cards. And if you like this video, subscribe and give me a thumbs up. I'll see you over in part 2.